Good afternoon, it's Lee Caskey from Tactile Technology, and we're on for another SMESec sessions. So we're actually moving forward and we're actually talking about network security today. So we're going to cover off some of the basics of it. And what I'll do is most likely return again to go into a little bit more depth and some of the kind of products that you can use in the future to try and ensure that you're getting a really secure network. Networking is quite a challenging area. It can be quite technical, but there are some technologies out there that make it simpler. And what I'll do, like I say, I'll revisit it in the future and come back with some of the technology that will make it a lot easier for you to actually do this. But what I wanted to do is to start with is go into network security, but also talk about the different components of a network to make sure that you understand what the terminology is. Because again, like in security, people don't always speak English. It's a bit like Klingon at times, and in networking, it's very similar. Lots of acronyms and information that's a bit too much for a lot of people. They don't understand quite the criteria that's been discussed. So let's go into a little bit of a diagram. I thought it might be easier starting with a diagram and try and break down each component and talk about some of the abbreviations I put on the screen there. So first of all, if we're in an office environment and we've got our office firewall or router or combination of the two, because sometimes we actually buy a device that does both firewall and routing. We also may have a device that is split and does both of them independently. So we have a device there that will stop effectively the bad guys coming in from the outside world into our infrastructure, and that's the main reason for it. But also it'll inspect some of the data that goes through it to ensure that it looks correct and it's going to the right place or going from the right place as well. So we can actually inspect to understand if they're coming from dodgy areas of the world. And what's happening at the moment with the Ukrainian conflict with Russia, there's a lot of malware and a lot of attacks coming out of Russia at the moment, and a lot of organizations are closing down any communications with infrastructure or email services within that area of Russia. So we can actually block specific areas as well. In the past, North Korea was a really dodgy area. We used to get a lot of issues with content and messaging coming from North Korea as well. So we can actually lock that down with those items. But the actual office firewall router is that point of contact with the outside world where we stop people traversing or coming across that into our network. And I'll cover a little bit more about what that means as well, because there are some things we might want to be able to get into our network, and we'll talk about the safety aspects of those in a little while. The outside world going out to the internet, we call it the WAN, the wide area network. So the wide area network is where we're going outbound, and the internal network is our local area network, or our LAN. So local area network and wide area network are two of the key things that we need to think about when we're actually talking about networking. And it's either side of our firewall router that we see that. So the outside side of the firewall router is the WAN. The inside of the network where our devices are connected in the office is our LAN, our local area network. A LAN is also, depending on the size of it, broken up into smaller, what we call segments, so different pieces of it. So we would use what we call a network switch. So if you've got a very small office and just a couple of PCs connected, you can actually use the actual firewall router to do that. It would have a small switch, normally about 4 ports on there. So 4 sockets that you can plug in your Ethernet cable and connect devices to it to be able to create a network locally. But if you're beyond that, normally you'll have a switch. So you'll have a separate device that's got, again, some data points in it. One of them we use to connect it to the router, and the others would then be used to connect to the rest of the devices. So, PCs, Macs, printers, anything that needs a physical connection will be connected to it. We may also have a wireless network as well. Some people utilize the actual firewall router to actually do this. So they're actually having it set up on there and it'll have either antennas or built in antennas to create that network. Normally, using the built in equipment, the range is quite limited because it's inside that case and it depends on where you fitted that device. So, works really well from a home network perspective, but can be a challenge when you're actually using it in a proper office environment. You can also actually create a network using wireless access points. So wireless access points fit normally on a wall or a ceiling, and you actually connect them with a physical connection to your firewall router, and then they will give wireless connectivity around the area. And you can put in multiples of them that can either connect to each other as a mesh or they're independent. You've got to configure them correctly. So that's that side, the office side, the kind of things that we normally have connected there. If you look across at the home office, normally we're gonna have some kind of home router. One of the things there is most people are providing those items themselves, or they're getting them delivered by the broadband provider. So, one of the key, be it like Sky, EE, uh, also Virgin Media or one of those organisations will provide that device, or you might put your own device in place to connect to. Couple of things about firewall routers. Make sure that you go in and change the password. Make it something that's not going to be easy to guess as well. And if you can, make sure it's not accessible from the outside world. Because a lot of times you don't really need to log into your firewall router from the outside unless it's actually a cloud managed one, which we tend to favor because we can actually remotely access and monitor and manage any of the networks using those type of devices. We commonly will use something like a Cisco Meraki MX device, which is a firewall device that we can remotely manage. But we can also look at security, configuration, and many other things through that as well, and also do testing and diagnostic work. So if you do put your own device in place, make sure that you're not using the default password, username and password, that it's been changed. Make sure you keep a note of it somewhere as well, because you might need to change the configuration. So you'll need that to hand. And if it's quite complex, you've got to make sure that you've saved it in something like a password manager. So it's not easily accessible from a hacker's perspective, but you've got access to it to be able to make changes in the future. So if we're at home, we commonly just connect directly to that device, or we might connect over the wireless network. So again, the wireless network, we need to make sure that we're using the highest level of encryption that we can utilize on the device. And there are a number of different ones. So at the lower level, we have a thing called WEP, which is a basic wireless encryption protocol. And we usually commonly use numbers to actually secure that. There are then another form which is called WPA PSK. So this is actually a much more a sophisticated mechanism to actually pass what we call keys. So PSK is a public and private key sharing mechanism. So what we can do is send a key to the device that are connecting and encrypt all the traffic that's being carried over that wireless signal to make sure, again, it can't be captured and decrypted and used by other people. So we need to make sure that our network configuration for the wireless is secure again, using some form of secure protocol, WEP or WPA PSK or WPA PSK2. There's two versions of it. Or if we're actually on a business environment and we've got the infrastructure for it, we can use what we call radius services. So radius is allowing us to create a login mechanism. We've got individual logins for each user, rather than in a home network environment or a home office environment. We tend to have a network name with a single password that's shared across multiple people. But having individual passwords for individual users, again, makes it much more difficult for the bad guys to get into your network. So I would suggest that if you're in an office environment and we can help with equipment and configuration for that, or something like that, if you wanted to look at it. So home office and our main office can get out to the internet using their wide area network links. and they can get then to software service setups. So Office 365 for email, of OneDrive for drive storage, using things like SharePoint to share documentation, and a variety of other services we might be utilizing there. So accounting service from Sage, from Xero, from QuickBooks, or those kind of solutions as well. Again, we need to protect that network link. We must make sure that we're using an encrypted link to there, and we need to use things like multi-form factor authentication, complex passwords, and also ensuring that we're using multiple different accounts rather than a single account that could be taken by someone and compromised. So a few things on that network side. The other thing we need to make sure is on our LAN, our local area network, we're protected. So we need to make sure that all the devices that are connected there are using some form of encryption when they're communicating on the local LAN. Traditionally, we use it quite basic Ethernet type technologies, but we need to ensure that if we're using something like a data switch, all of the ports that aren't in use are turned off, because we don't want someone to quite easily plug in their laptop or a device into the network, into one of the switches, and listen to all of the traffic that's on the network and capture everything that's been done, passwords, usernames, those kind of things. So ensuring that all switches have all of their ports disabled if they're not being utilized is a good thing to do. The next thing to do is separate traffic types. So if we've got things like voice services, so VoIP or IP, over, was it voice over IP, depending on what terminology you want to use, we should really separate that traffic from the data traffic. So keeping two separate networks. Most switches these days have got the ability to create what we call virtual LANs. So a virtual LAN, one for the voice and one for the data services. And if we're using things like servers as well as PCs on the same network, we may want to separate those onto a separate network. And again, we can control how we access that network, because we could say from the outside world, no one can come in directly onto the local LAN, but they can come in to the server network where we've got maybe a particular service being available and delivered externally, something like a web service, but again, configured in such a way it's secure, which is quite important. The other thing we didn't talk about that's on the diagram is VPN. A lot of people know what this abbreviation means. It's a virtual private network. And what it allows us to do is connect either two PCs together, so a PC and another server, or PC at another site, or a PC and the network, or the multiple networks, so the home office network and the office network together. And what we use is, again, a public-private key sharing mechanism where we actually pass keys between the two, and we utilize those keys to encrypt the data traffic so that when the information is sent, it's completely encrypted and it can't be eavesdropped by the hacker, and it can't be decrypted because we're using a mechanism that makes it really difficult because of the number of combinations and also the key types that we're actually utilizing. So we can protect that. One thing we've got to be very careful of, though, especially with home workers, and we'll come on to that with step 10 next week, is when we've got home workers and mobile workers, sometimes they're given the responsibility to actually configure and manage their infrastructure themselves because it's their home network. It's provided with their home broadband, with their home broadband router. So we need to take more care how that configuration is done, making sure that not only the actual router and the VPN is configured correctly, but also the PC itself is encrypted correctly. So encrypting files in such a way as they can't be easily extracted and taken by the hackers. Also that they can't get in through that service and take control of that PC and then use the VPN to actually get into the network, because once they've got access to that PC, they can use that VPN to get into the office network and then take control of other machines. So we need to make sure that all of those network configurations are configured correctly. We're using good password management. We're using complex passwords, and we're not sharing passwords across multiple devices, which can be a real challenge because it could be that one of those passwords has been found. So there's a hack of some kind of website that you utilize. They get all the usernames and passwords, and they actually will try those passwords and multiple combinations of them on other services. So we need to make sure we're protecting those. So hopefully that's giving you a bit of a picture of what we can do around network security, looking at the configuration, the components and the names of those components to make it hopefully easier for you to understand how all these pieces fit together. So our next session tomorrow, we'll actually move on to manage user privileges. And this is a key area. It's also an area that's utilized by hackers quite a lot to access information and get into services that you've got access to as an administrator. Also, the IT side of things. So if we've got a larger business with an IT group, privileges can be a real challenge there, and ensuring that we manage those privileges is key. So we'll come on to that tomorrow. So thank you very much for joining me today. Join me tomorrow at 12:30 to 12:45, where we take the next step 4, and we talk about managed privileges. Any questions, make comments on any of the social media videos so I can actually see those, or contact me directly if you choose to. But anyway, thank you very much for today, and hopefully see you tomorrow. Thank you.